sponsored by the James Madison Council.
Hello and welcome to everyone. My name is Bilal Qureshi. I will be the moderator of this session with the Pulitzer Prize winning author Isabel Wilkerson. We will be discussing her book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, at this 2021 edition of the National Book Festival. Ms. Wilkerson, welcome to the Library of Congress National Book Festival.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad to be here with you.
And, we're speaking to you, more than a year after your book was published. And I think it would not be an understatement to say that it was a book that made a huge impact and had a very profound effect on a lot of the people who read it. And it helped, I think, many people, frankly, understand the past year. And I wonder what that's like as an author to have now seen this book in the world and be received the way that it was.
Well, it's surreal because we're in an age where, because of the pandemic, we've been isolated from one another. To have a book come out in this era where there's veil between ourselves as authors and the readership, it's so completely different than what we would be accustomed to, and yet we've had to persevere through it. Another thing is that this book was written long before we could have even imagined that there would be a pandemic, and yet the opening chapter situates us in a time of a different kind of virus or a different kind of pathogen, starting with what was going on in the Siberian tundra in the summer of 2016. And connecting that to a more global awareness of the dangers of division that we have inherited. And so it was quite stunning, and really, unexpected that we would actually be in the midst of a pandemic at the time this book was released, that it would be released just weeks after what we all saw happen to George Floyd, which galvanized the world with alarm and a desire to confront these longstanding divisions. So it's just been surreal to have it out there in the world. You work so hard on a book, you worked for so long in the research, and then in the construction of it, and then the writing of it, and the editing of it, and all of the things that you go through. You have no way of knowing, no way of planning what the world will be like when you finish it. And so this seems to have been a confluence of the mission of the work with the circumstances into which it was released. And I can only say that I feel that the timing, even though it could not be planned, ended up being, in some ways, very inspired.
I've always loved the idea that writers write sometimes the books that they wish existed for themselves. And it's an opportunity to really, have an intervention in a way in our thinking about, in this case, America and how America was set up. And of course, as you mentioned, you began this book much earlier than the pandemic and, the murder of George Floyd and all the incidents that have followed. But what absence had you seen, or what had you sensed was not in the air enough in terms of understanding the way America was structured? I want to know about the void that you perhaps felt as a writer that you wished to address by articulating this. And I've always loved also I think it's in your Instagram profile as well. You say I write about human nature, and I love that idea as well. But I wanted to know about what in our nature had you felt a void about that you wish to address with this book.
Well, the second book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, arises from the Warren Brother Sons, in which, I'd spent 15 years to research and to narrate the experience of 6 million African Americans who, in some ways, they fled the Jim Crow South, but they were really defecting one part of the country for another part of the country. They were seeking political asylum within the borders of their own country. And in doing so, to be able to understand why they were doing what they were doing required me to, not just do the research into the archives, but to listen to the stories and experiences of the people, and to find out what was it that they were fleeing. And then ultimately, they were fleeing a regime that was so specific and so extreme that it was against the law for a Black person and a white person to merely play checkers together. There were actually a Black Bible and an altogether separate white Bible to swear to tell the truth on in court, and courtrooms throughout the South. And so it was a world that was so tightly scripted, so rigidly enforced and surveilled, that any breach of that world, of that system, of that regime could literally mean a person's life. And that's what they were fleeing. And so that exposed me to the origins and the nature of the both jurisprudence and the protocols that were in place in the American South, in some ways the birthplace of what I would call caste in our country. It was self-evident in the experiences of the people who were fleeing that world, fleeing that regime. And so after writing the book, I mean, I felt that I used the word caste throughout the book, and then as we enter the world that would ultimately propel the Black Lives Matter movement, and I would suggest that begins with Trayvon Martin, the killing of Trayvon Martin. Then this was a reintroduction. It was a reintroducing to all of us of the kind of protocols and the things that could be done to this group in particular. And there was something about the case of Trayvon Martin that really touched everyone, obviously, but especially for me, because where Trayvon Martin was from, where he was killed, was the same part of Florida that one of the protagonists of The Warmth of the Suns was from. And so it was a place that I'd been to, it was a place I was familiar with. And so it instantly got my attention in that way. And I wrote a piece, an op-ed piece for the New York Times, connecting the idea of caste, the concept of caste, to what had happened to Trayvon Martin. And one of the reasons it came to my attention and why I was able to make that connection was because what happened to Trayvon Martin did not fit the expected Black and white narrative that we've come to expect whenever there are attacks, for example, racial attacks. And George Zimmerman was of Latinx descent. And it was a different way of looking at what I view as a continuing through line in our country's hierarchy. And in other words, the person who killed Trayvon Martin was in some ways acting as an enforcer of a hierarchy that we all had inherited. And thus that prompted me to sort of awaken to the ways in which it was acting in our current era. And that was one of the first things that set me on the path toward this book. And then, of course, that was succeeded by or followed by case after case, a metronome of videos, a metronome of names: Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Jonathan Crawford, Jonathan Farrell, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. There have been so many of these cases, and there's case after case after case. And they seemed to me to be a reminder of the enduring hierarchy of what can be done to people what is allowed to occur to people who are assigned to the very bottom of a hierarchy. And that is what set me on the path of doing a further investigation into a concept that I had brought up and explored, language that I've used in The Warmth of the Suns, but that required, in my view, a deeper investigation.
Well, the other thing, I mean, your book puts forward this almost architectural. You use all this language of sort of the house and its foundations, the tentacles of a society that one is not able to extricate oneself from. There's a systemic, structural explanation, and you also sort of describe yourself as being like a house inspector that has come to reveal that there is a very rotten foundation at the core of the home that we're trying to build in this country. I guess I think the other thing that's so striking to me about the book is that when one looks at the narrative around America and its racial inequality, there's this sense of, the arc of justice. We're moving forward. We're marching forward in some way, despite the problems. And then the list that you've just given among all the other people who are constantly limited and restricted by this rotting foundation illustrates that that, despite this narrative that we may prefer as a country, there is, the system that exists and the structure that exists. Why has there been a reluctance, do you think, to talk about America as having a caste system, as having a structural, um, foundational perimeter? I mean, I think that I'm wondering why you think there has been that reluctance, and in a way, that's one of the things about your book that was so striking to all of us who read it and have thought about it is that it reimagines also the story that we tell to ourselves about our country. So I'm just curious about
Oh,
the absence of the word caste in our discourse.
I would say that for a host of reasons. One is that it's language that we don't often apply to any place outside of the more familiar iterations of caste. Obviously, India is first to come to mind, and then also you might say feudal Europe as ways of understanding old, long-standing hierarchical systems. And yet it had been the preserve of anthropologists who went into the Jim Crow South in the 1930s and 40s. They actually, interestingly enough, went there because there was in the North there was a tremendous amount of interest in what was the reason for millions of African Americans defecting the Jim Crow South and coming to the North. Interestingly enough, it was the Great Migration that propelled many of the social scientists who went into the Jim Crow South to understand what was going on. They could get funding because there was great urgency in understanding what was causing this great flood of people out of the South and into the North. And so they went in, and the people, they actually risked their lives to go into the Jim Crow South, in particular, those who were African American, those who were Black, who went into the Jim Crow South, had to risk their lives in order to study it because they had to act in accord with the protocols, expectations, customs and laws that were in place that held an entire group in subjugation, and they had to act subservient. They had to act in a subordinated manner, which was against, of course, their tremendous education and personal bearing. So they had to, in some ways, act the role of being subservient and subjugated in that world. And they spent, some of them spent years studying the Jim Crow South, risking their lives, as I said, and emerged from their research using the language of caste. These are people who lived it, these are people who studied it, but it remained in some ways in the purview of the academy. It remained, they were writing, obviously, scholarly works. And I came to become aware of their work in working on researching the Warrant for the Sons. And that was an effort to be able to honor the work that they had done by recognizing their contribution, but not just to scholarship, but also to my own understanding of the Jim Crow South as I was writing about it with the Warrant for the Sons. I also would say that, that it has come up time and time again, from Charles Sumner, who made reference to it, to Martin Luther King, who came to the recognition that this was language, this was a concept that could be applied and could be useful in understanding our own country's hierarchy. He made this historic trip to India in 1959. He was greeted as a visiting dignitary upon arrival. He'd always wanted to go there because he'd been following the nonviolent protest philosophy of Mohandas Gandhi. But when he got a chance to go there, he wanted to visit the southern part of the country. He wanted to visit with the people who were then known as untouchables, now known as Dalits. And upon arrival, the principal at the school he visited was very excited to greet him and introduce him to the students there. And so he said, "Young people, I wish to introduce you to a fellow untouchable from the United States of America." And when Dr. King heard that language, he first bristled at that description of himself. He did not see himself in that way at all. He, again, as with most Americans, he thought that that is something that applied to lands far, far away. He didn't see the connection to himself at all. In fact, he was quite peeved to be seen as someone who would be viewed as untouchable. And then he thought about it. He thought about what was at that time 40 million. At that time there were 20 million Black people in the United States who were at that very moment being held in a fixed place, unable, not permitted to vote, not permitted to be part of the body politic, being held in a fixed place, their occupations and their access to the economy. They were excluded from the economy in many, many ways. And he thought about it, the fact that the movement that he was then leading was being met with tremendous resistance, hostility, and in fact, violence. And he thought about it and he said to himself, I am an untouchable. And every Black person in the United States is an untouchable too. So he came to the realization that most Americans would not have had, but he came to that realization because those who knew best what a caste system was, those who were living at the very bottom of the caste system in India, recognized the connection of their system of hierarchy to our own and recognized who fit where in the hierarchy in the United States. And that's how he came to the awareness of that.
Well, and you in your own writing and of this book, you went to India and you attended events and spoke with people around the issue of how caste remains, of course, a really rigid system within a country like India and within South Asian diasporas as well. For you, you're in the research and in the writing of this, it's both. I mean, it's both a journalistic and historical work, but it also has what reads to me sometimes like this feeling of a sermon that you're delivering. Like there's a real sense that you're kind of, I don't know, it feels to me like a really interdisciplinary work. Can I ask you about how you thought about both the field reporting merging with this kind of message that you wished to deliver, because it has this sense, as I said, of an address almost that you're giving to the reader?
Well, in some ways, you and I, we had a chance to talk before, and in talking with you before, the language of prayer, came up in our beautiful conversation, actually. And I view it as as not an argument, but as a prayer, a plea to the country, and in fact to humanity, to recognize the divisions that we've inherited, and to recognize that, as with the old house that a person might inherit, you are not responsible. You did not create the uneven pillars and joists and beams. They were not your direct doing, but it is your responsibility once you take possession. Once you then take possession of that which you have inherited, then anything going forward is your responsibility. And that's how I approach the discussion of our country's history. And I looked at this as as a way of shining a light onto what we otherwise might not see. And the process that I use with all of my work is interdisciplinary, when you look at it from a research perspective. But I also think of it as, in some ways, weaving. I feel as if I'm weaving a fabric that will ultimately become a single remnant. I'm collecting remnants of fabric that will be pulled together to stitch together a quilt that will bring together many, many different perspectives, many ways of looking at a particular concept, many, many interviews, personal introspection, the many, many ways that those who've gone before me have looked at the topic, whatever it is that I'm looking at. It's a massive quilt that I'm attempting to create with every work that I produce. And I don't always know when I begin what the end result will look like. I don't know what that quilt is going to look like. And I might move the pieces around. I mean, I may, stitch something together and then unravel it and put it back together so that it becomes, and what I view narrative nonfiction having the potential to be works of art. I mean, I believe that narrative nonfiction is the closest that many of us will ever get to being another person, because narrative nonfiction is often driven by protagonists, it's driven from the ground up, from the perspective of individuals who are living a particular phenomenon. And so it requires going very deep into the motivations, into the experiences, into the responses that individuals may have to whatever the circumstances they might find themselves in, the phenomenon that they may be attempting to survive within. And it becomes the closest that you get to actually being another person, because it pulls together the beauty of empathy building, the empathy building that comes from fiction, because you're, making use of the approach and the tools of storytelling that novelists and fiction writers may use, but it's based upon and dependent upon the research, the fact-based, verifiable research that is necessary for nonfiction. And it's a weaving together of those two so that you produce a work of narrative nonfiction that presumably or hopefully will pull the reader in, allow that reader to almost be another person, and to build empathy and perspective so that they can have an understanding of a concept, understanding of a phenomenon from the inside out, from the ground up, not from the top down, but from the bottom up. And so that's the approach that I take. And it takes a long time. The first book took 15 years. I often say if it were a human being, it would be in high school and dating. That's how long the first book took. This book took about half that time. So I'm improving when it comes to that.
Well, the theme of this year's National Book Festival is open a book, open the world, and open, and I wondered, you've just described the sort of role of fiction in your own life, and of course these books being world building in a way for yourself. I mean, you take such a long time to construct these and weave these. What would you say about that theme of opening a book and opening the world? And particularly, I find that a very fitting message for this book, because it is, in fact, it includes the story of India and caste in India. It includes a world beyond America too, where rigid systems of caste restrict people's outcomes and life possibilities. So the theme of opening a book and opening the world, I wonder what you would make of that and how you would reflect on that.
Yeah, well, I view libraries as vaults of knowledge. And I also view them, especially in the era that we're in now, as an era in which many Americans are awakening to a country that they did not truly get a chance to know through their formal education. This is a golden age of unfurling of perspectives that have not been built into the ways that the ways that history is taught in our country. And so I could say with, the One for the Sons, for example, that many people after that book came out would say to me, I had no idea that these things happened in our country. I had no idea this happened in my region of the country, whatever it may have been that they had no idea of. And so this is one of the reasons why libraries are so incredibly central and urgent now, because so many people are thirsty for knowledge to understand what they might not have understood before, what they did not learn growing up. This is a time where people are hungering for answers because there is so much that has not often made sense to many people. And we often in the last few years have heard people say, I don't recognize my country. This is not America. This is not what America stands for. And whenever I hear that, I'm reminded that not enough of us know our country's true history. And that is one of the places, that is where libraries come in, because libraries, to me, are the second wave of knowledge, the second wave of opportunity for people to learn what they did not know before. We have an entire vault of knowledge available to people now at a moment where people have been thirsting more than ever to understand things that may not have made sense otherwise. And so that's how I view libraries as in some ways the second wave of education for our entire society.
Well, this education that you're describing that America has been sort of quite bluntly at times enduring and experiencing and going through, which has been a very difficult process as well. And of course, any kind of awakening like this would be. The term reckoning is often used for what we've been experiencing. And I remember reading your book last summer. I'm from Richmond, Virginia, and we were having all the monuments being pulled off of the pedestals, which had been debated for all these years. And suddenly, in the midst of the reckoning, things have just taken on an urgency. And your work came out at the beginning of what felt like this popular cultural discussion. And now I think about all the things in our culture, Clint Smith's new book that's just come out, the Underground Railroad adaptation that Barry Jenkins has released, things that, frankly are long overdue assessments and reimagining of our history and thinking, not even reimagining, but finally reckoning with it. How do you think about this last year, and especially the public education that we're having? It's uncomfortable, it's messy, it's often still very divisive. What to how to kind of think as an American of the reckoning, now that we've had a year plus of this popular version of it.
Well, it is necessary. There's, I have, there are many metaphors in the book, as you know, and one of them that comes to mind for me right now is the idea that when you go to the doctor um, and you have an ailment, one of the first things that the doctor's office will hand you is a clipboard. And on that clipboard, there are many, 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 many questions that they want answered. And that is essentially taking inventory of your history. Oftentimes, the doctor will not even begin to even examine you, much less come up with a diagnosis until the doctor knows your history. And we are in this current era have been made aware of the deep-seated divisions, fissures, ruptures that we are dealing with. It's all too evident. And that has called upon us to do an inventory to understand how we got to where we are. If when we go to the doctor for a single patient, it's necessary to know the history of that patient before even hazarding a guess at a diagnosis. How much more essential is it to understand the history of a country before hazarding an effort toward reconciling, reckoning, or beginning to address and correct, overhaul, whatever it takes to fix what is wrong? And I think that it's not even an option; it's essential, and that's how I'm looking at it.
Your book has a dedication to those who have broken caste that you've known, and you talk about this in the book as well. And it's one of the reasons I continue to find it, such an inspiring idea, that one of the gifts of having a reckoning is that then you have the opportunity to change, and the opportunity to hopefully break the systems that we have, at least to work toward breaking them. What does breaking caste mean to you, and what can those of us who are wishing to at least be able to reflect, but also hopefully progress from the state that we're born into? I mean, what does breaking caste mean to you?
Well, breaking caste requires, from my perspective, looking past the assigned roles that have been applied to each and every one of us. When you think about, for one thing, when you think about caste without an E, when you think about the rigidity of the apparatus that is, attached to an arm when there are fractured bones, caste. I mean, it keeps the bones rigid in a fixed place. You think about the cast of a play, in which, on that stage, you have someone stage right and stage left in the foreground and in the background. And that everyone on that stage knows the lines that they're to speak, and they know the place that they are to remain during that production. Cast without an E gives us a better sense of, a clearer sense of what exactly a caste system demands of people who are invested in maintaining it. And one of the things that does is that if you think about the cast in a play, those who know their lines and stick to their lines, and they know when someone is stepping out of their place in that play. And in that case, everyone might make adjustments, or they may call that person out because that person has stepped out of the assigned role that everyone on the stage knows that person is supposed to remain in. And so there are many, many answers to the question that you've given, which is why I wrote the book. But, one of them is just an awareness of and a willingness to fight against the assumed roles that are assigned to all of us, and to not to recognize that we all have been programmed in expecting or assumptions, of who belongs where in the society. And once we recognize that we've been programmed to believe in these things, once we recognize that we ourselves have been programmed to act in a certain way in accord with the assignment based upon our location, the location of the people the group that we were born to and where that group is located in the hierarchy. Once we recognize that, that's one of the first, the first ways of fighting something is to first recognize that you have something to fight for or against anyway. And so recognizing it is the first step toward vanquishing it. And that was the goal of this work, is to first shine a light on it so that we can see beneath what we thought we might know about the hierarchy that we have inherited, so that we can begin the work together to dismantle these hierarchies, to dismantle the inequities that are built into our society, and to recognize that each of us were born without any, without our having done anything to this artificial, arbitrary graded ranking of human value that determines one's standing, respect, benefit of the doubt, access to resources or denial of access to resources, assumptions of competence and intelligence and worthiness, all these things that we have inherited, and then that we then project onto others on the basis of the assumptions and stereotypes. And so that's just one out of many things, because this is a structural issue. This is the infrastructure of our divisions, and it requires an inspection and overhaul of all of the systems within the infrastructure, criminal justice, education, law enforcement, housing, transportation. Every single system within our society has the imprint of centuries of inequities. They are built into the infrastructure of our country, and it requires everything and everyone to overturn these embedded, inherited divisions. And so there's not one answer to that, but the first one is awareness that it exists to begin with.
Well, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, since we've been thinking in the National Book Festival around the idea of books over this particular year. I mean, you've had your book be out during the pandemic. Most of your events have been virtual from where you're joining us today. How has reading been a part of your year, and how have you turned to books now that you've finished your book? You may have already been writing another one. I'm not sure if that's already in progress. I would imagine it may be, but how has reading played a part in your own experience of this last year, and of maybe perhaps even a renewed sense of purpose of what writers do, because your book has been a huge part of many of our year?
Well, I have to say that I think all of us are in a bubble, and I'm in a bubble too. And that bubble has been one where I could not have anticipated how demanding this era that we're in would be. I could not have anticipated how this book would move out into the world. I could not have anticipated that essentially I would be, in some ways, engaged deeply with this one work day in and day out for months. I had no idea that this is what it was going to be. I have literally been in my own bubble dealing with this one thing almost nonstop. And I had no idea how it was going to be taken up by people who have taken it upon themselves to give talks about this book. I mean, there have been times where we'll see something come up on social media somewhere where a talk's being given at Bryn Mawr or wherever it might be, and I'll say to someone, we have an event at Bryn Mawr on Tuesday, and they'll say, no, that's not us, that's someone else. There are talks being given, every week. I have nothing to do with that. I mean, this is simply something that is occurring independent of anything that I might do. It has taken on a life of its own. I should also say that one of the profoundly moving moments in the time since this book has been out is that it's been on the bestseller list since it's been out. I mean, which is just an astonishing thing. But one thing that's significant it became number one only at one particular moment. It's been out all this time. It's been on the bestseller list for months, but only 1 week was it number one. 1 week and 1 week alone. And that was the week of the 2020 election. That was the only week. And I think that says something profound about this searching for understanding at a critical moment in our country's history, and how Americans turned to this book at that moment, that one moment. It was only number one that one week, never before and never after. And that says that there was something that people were yearning to understand, and they seem to be turning to this book to do so.
Well, it's been such an honor to speak to you a second time among many of the people who have had a chance to speak with you, the many people you have spoken to, the spin-off editions of Caste that other people have had on their own. But yeah, I mean, it's a book that has provided so many of us understanding and reflection, and as you said, and prayers as well for a potential for another way of being. So it's been a gift to speak with you. Thank you for joining the National Book Festival in 2021. And again, Isabel Wilkerson, author of Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents.
Thank you so much for having me.
We hope you've enjoyed this conversation. And now we'd like you to hear more from the library's own experts on this topic.
Welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm joining you today from Mahogany Row in the Jefferson Building, one of the library's many historic spaces. I am Ryan Reft, and I am a historian in the Manuscript Division at the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress Manuscript Division holds what is perhaps the most extensive and comprehensive collection of personal papers and organizational records relating to American history and culture ever assembled, such as the papers of 23 presidents and 36 Supreme Court justices, including recent members of the court, Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sandra Day O'Connor, and John Paul Stevens. Through the papers of Supreme Court justices held in the library's Manuscript Division, one can better grasp the legal structures that have worked to establish, maintain, and even dismantle racial inequality, or what Isabel Wilkerson discusses as caste in her book of the same title. The Supreme Court institutionalized segregation in its 1896 ruling, Plessy v. Ferguson. Segregation's dismantling required decades of litigation brought by organizations like the NAACP and argued by attorneys such as Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall, and all sustained by a civil rights movement led by W.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and others, culminating in segregation's legal demise in 1954's Brown v. Board of Education. After hearing the case, Chief Justice Earl Warren, as evidenced by these congratulatory notes from Justices William O. Douglas, Harold Burton, and Felix Frankfurter, all found in the Earl Warren papers, courted, charmed, and cajoled his fellow justices toward a unanimous decision. While the ruling does have its critics, Warren put forth in simple, straightforward language an opinion that both conveyed its gravity and could be easily reprinted in newspapers across the U.S. As Wilkerson notes in her interview, libraries offer us all a chance to build upon what we know about American history. While most Americans are aware of the famous Brown decision, an equally important aspect of the ruling followed a year later and often receives less attention. Though the Brown decision would, over time, reshape American institutions, its enforcement proved more difficult and complex, as represented by Justice Felix Frankfurter's draft decree to enforce the Brown v. Board of Education decision issued on April 8, 1955, from the Felix Frankfurter papers. After the Brown opinion was announced, the court heard additional arguments during the following term on the decree for implementing the ruling. Frankfurter, knowing the preferences of his colleagues, used the phrase, "with all deliberate speed," seen here, written in Frankfurter's hand, just below the crossed-out typescript, to replace forthwith the word proposed by the NAACP's lawyers to achieve an accelerated desegregation timetable. Unfortunately, this phrasing made the work of integration invariably more difficult. In many places, opponents of desegregation used all deliberate speed as a legal justification refusing to fully integrate, and in some cases forcing the closure of public school systems for years. The Brown decision undoubtedly remains a crucial part of America's jurisprudence, but its implementation did not always equal its promise. The Felix Frankfurter papers and the Earl Warren papers represent just 2 of the 36 collections from justices of the Supreme Court, including Thurgood Marshall, as well as the over 24 judges from the lower federal courts available to researchers in the Manuscript Division at the Library of Congress.